On an island where Britain's highest sea cliffs rise 430 metres above the roaring Atlantic, children once learned to climb rock before they could walk, and seabirds outnumbered people 1,000 to 1. For 4,000 years, hardship bred a crime-free, fiercely united community, so remote that a simple cold could be fatal, and visitors brought only danger. What could force such endurance to finally vanish? The answer begins at St Kilda's very edge. St Kilda rises from the Atlantic as a fortress of rock and wind. 65 kilometres west of the Outer Hebrides, the islands are surrounded by ocean on every side, with no shelter from storms that sweep across thousands of kilometres of open water. The cliffs of Conachare on Hirta reach 430 metres, higher than any other sea cliff in Britain. For comparison, the White Cliffs of Dover stand at just 110 metres and Beachy Head at 162 metres. Here, the land ends not in gentle slopes, but in sheer vertical walls that plunge straight into the sea. The archipelago is more than a single island. Hirta, the largest and the only island ever permanently inhabited, is joined by Dun, which guards the main bay, and by the outlying masses of Soay and Borroway. Beyond Borroway, two black sea stacks, Stack and Armin and Stack Lee, rise 196 metres and 172 metres from the ocean, towers of stone battered day and night by waves and wind. These stacks and cliffs are not just dramatic scenery, they are alive with movement and sound. Each summer, over 1 million seabirds flock to St Kilda, filling every ledge and crevice. Gannets, fulmars, puffins and kittiwakes crowd the rocks so densely that from a distance the cliffs appear white with guano. The islands hold the world's largest North Atlantic gannet colony and the United Kingdom's largest fulmar population. On St Kilda, the scale of nature is overwhelming. Storm waves have been measured at 16 metres, high enough to swallow a house. Winds can reach 144 miles per hour, strong enough to move boulders the size of cars. For most of the year, the islands are unreachable, completely cut off by the Atlantic's moods. In this place, every fact of life is dictated by raw exposure and distance. The cliffs, the isolation, and the teeming bird colonies form a world apart, where geography sets the terms for everything that follows. Archaeology reveals a human presence on St Kilda stretching back 4,000 years. The earliest pottery fragments and stone tools found east of Village Bay point to people arriving during the Bronze Age. Later, evidence of Iron Age farming and cultivation soils shows that these islands were not just visited, but settled and worked. By the time the Romans reached Britain, a community was already established here, adapting to the Atlantic's hard edge. From the medieval period onward, records and place names confirm a resident population. Norse names linger in the landscape, a trace of Viking contact and centuries of navigation across these waters. The first written account comes from an Icelandic cleric in 1202, describing shelter on Hirtir, the island's ancient name. By the 17th century, the community was well known enough to draw the attention of Martin Martin, a Scottish writer who visited in 1697. He described a society bound by cooperation and mutual trust, much happier than most people, almost the only people in the world who feel the sweetness of true liberty, simplicity, mutual love, and cordial friendship. No record of theft or violence ever appears in St Kilda's history. Survival here depended on absolute harmony. Children learned to climb before they could read, their games played on stone walls and rocky slopes. By adolescence, they joined the adults on the cliffs, harvesting seabirds to feed the community. Over centuries, this way of life became tradition, passed down through generations, shaped by the demands of the island. In a world defined by risk and scarcity, St Kildans mastered the art of living on the edge, forging a culture as enduring as the cliffs themselves. Stone cleits scatter the green slopes of Hirta, over 1,200 of them, more than twice the island's peak population. These low, turf-roofed storehouses are unlike anything found elsewhere in the world. Their walls are built with deliberate gaps, letting the Atlantic wind flow straight through, while the thick turf above sheds rain. Inside, the air stays cool and dry, perfect for preserving the island's most precious resources: dried seabirds, salted meat, eggs, peat, wool, and grain. St Kildans relied on these stores for survival. With 90% of their diet coming from birds hauled off the cliffs, every cleat became a lifeline between the summer's harvest and the long, storm-bound winter. The design turns the island's fiercest enemy, the wind, into an ally, drying food that would rot anywhere else. Each cleat stands as proof of a community that engineered survival out of stone, air, and necessity. Every time a ship landed on St Kilda, illness soon followed. The islanders called it Kinaitan Nan Gol, the stranger's cold. Within days of a visitor's arrival, coughs and fever would sweep through the tiny community. The symptoms were always the same: headaches, fatigue, aching limbs. Even the healthiest men and women would be laid low, sometimes unable to work or tend to their children. Records from the 18th and 19th centuries note that these outbreaks arrived with predictable regularity, as if the mere presence of outsiders carried invisible threats on the salt wind. Modern doctors see this as the result of extreme isolation. Generations without exposure to common viruses left the islanders with no natural defenses. A simple cold for a visitor could become a debilitating wave of illness for the whole village. Each new ship was a risk, and every handshake or shared meal could upend the fragile balance of survival on the edge of the Atlantic. In 1727, a boat from the Hebrides brought smallpox to St Kilda. The infection swept through the island with terrifying speed. Within weeks, most of the adults were dead. Later accounts say only 3 or 4 grown survivors remained, surrounded by children. Graves filled the turf above Village Bay, while the living struggled to bury the dead and to keep hunger at bay. At the same time, a group of St Kildan men sent to harvest gannets on Stachanarmin found themselves trapped. Atlantic storms cut them off for months. They survived on raw seabirds, eggs, and rainwater, sheltering in crude stone huts on a rock rising nearly 200 meters above the sea. For month after month, they watched the horizon for a boat that never came. When the weather finally relented and they returned, their home was unrecognizable. The village stood silent, with only a handful of exhausted adults and frightened children left. The men who had survived the Atlantic's fury now faced the harder work of rebuilding a shattered world. By the late 19th century, St Kilda's isolation no longer held. Steamships began to arrive each summer, bringing tourists eager to glimpse the edge of Britain. For the first time, money changed hands. For tweed, feathers, and eggs, cash spent on mainland goods that soon felt essential. The old rhythm of barter and sharing gave way to the uncertain pulse of a cash economy. Then, during the First World War, the Royal Navy built a wireless station on Hirta. Messages crossed the Atlantic gap in seconds, not weeks. News, requests, and even warnings reached the islanders almost instantly. The outside world was no longer distant. It was suddenly present in every conversation and in every expectation. Mary Gillies was a young mother, full of hope for her family's future. In early 1930, she developed severe abdominal pain, appendicitis, a routine emergency on the mainland, but a death sentence on St Kilda. Nurse Williamina Barclay, who had cared for the islanders for 2 years, wrote in her letters of the helplessness she felt watching Mary slip away. With no doctor and no way to reach a hospital in time, Mary died in her cottage, leaving behind a grieving husband and child. Her death forced the community to face the truth. Life here could no longer protect its own. 36 islanders signed a petition asking the government to help them leave together, not as exiles, but as a people choosing dignity over despair. On the morning of August 29, 1930, the last families gathered their belongings and stepped onto HMS Harebell. Each cottage was left with its Bible open to Psalm 23 and a bowl of oats on the table, a gesture of respect for the home and land they were leaving behind. Doors were locked for the final time. Decades later, St Kilda's empty village and wild slopes would be entrusted to the National Trust for Scotland. In 1986, UNESCO recognized the islands for their natural wonders, and in 2005 for their cultural legacy, Scotland's only dual World Heritage Site. Today, St Kilda stands empty, its stone cleits outlasting the people who built them. As climate, isolation, and technology redraw the boundaries of survival, the island's story warns that not every place shaped by human endurance can be remade for modern needs. Some worlds remain beyond reach. Share your thoughts below.